they don't appreciate, because the job of an MP seems to me to think that every wrong needs to be legislated for. So if the police are, for example, not enforcing a particular law, well, let's have another law. Well, the answer is actually get the police to enforce the laws that we already have. Nearly always, when people say, "Oh goodness me, this should never happen, let's have a law about it," you will find there are perfectly good laws about it. They may or may not have been enforced. There may have been a problem with the police force, but nearly always that's where the problem is.
For the wrong to rule, the good must just stand idly by.
Hello. 18 months ago, I was sat in a little office Googling how to start a political party. The intention behind my desire to start a political party was my concern about the encroachment of the government on freedom of speech. And the best thing I've done since then, and the thing I'm most proud of, is this. It's called In Protection of Free Speech. And it has a foreword by Jonathan Sumption, who says, "Some of what people believe will be wrong. Some of it may even be harmful, not just to those who hold those beliefs, but to others. We cannot have truth without accommodating error. It is the price we pay for allowing knowledge and understanding to develop and human civilization to advance." Now, the next piece of this report, which provides legal remedies to freedom of speech, was written by the person I'm joined by today, the absolutely wonderful Francis Hoar. Francis, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
How's freedom of speech doing a year on?
We're going to talk about the online safety bill, which is at the moment the biggest concern, simply because it's there. It's a government bill.
So for punters, for someone who's no idea what the online safety bill is, what is the online safety bill?
It is a means by which, so it's a bill would be an act of Parliament if Parliament pass it, and it goes through both Houses of Parliament and Royal Assent. And the intention is to prevent the type of, or the supposed intention at least, is to prevent the kind of trolling, abuse, harassment. And then you can think of all sorts of other things that go online that are unsavoury and thoroughly dangerous. Suicide chat rooms, obviously paedophilia and dangerous provisions for children and so on. So there's a background which most people will have, or almost everyone will have sympathy for, the idea that we do need some control of content on the internet. So that's fine, but the concern is how this is being done.
What would be the bonuses of that? Because obviously I wouldn't want, I think suicide chat rooms are probably really bad, and they could encourage and motivate people and to commit suicide. So what are the good parts of this?
So the point that we were making in the report is that sort of thing is already illegal. So suicide, encouraging people to commit suicide is illegal. Assisting people to commit suicide is illegal. So to use that particular example, a suicide chat room by itself is effectively an unlawful enterprise. And if it was found and shut down, that would be, not only would that be allowed under the current legislation, but it would be required, really, because as soon as Facebook or Twitter become aware of it and they allow that to happen, they potentially share in some of that criminal or liability or civil liability potentially as well.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but I'm just why do they currently share? Are they not protected by the fact that they're a platform rather than a publisher?
Two reasons, and probably we need to explain what a publisher is. But the first reason is because as soon as they become aware of it, they could be accused of facilitating and allowing that to happen without removing it, irrespective of whether they're a publisher. The second reason is that the way in which a publisher is defined in the law at the moment is, and this is another point that we make, is quite sensible. It goes back a lot of principles in the common law systems that it started in England, America, Canada, South Africa, Israel, etc., where effectively where the British Empire used to be. it's developed alongside according to precedent. So it moves, the law moves with human society, and that's why it can be very effective, can work very well. And one of the things that's done that is the definition of who is a publisher online. So the original definition goes back to cases with notice boards. So if you host a notice board in a village, and you say anyone can put adverts on this, you can talk about the local fete, you can advertise, you want to sell your sofa and so on. You are not the publisher of those things, but you do become the publisher if you become aware of them. So if somebody puts a seriously defamatory
Kill Mrs. Miggins.
Kill Mrs. or Mr. Snooks is a pedo or something like that. And you look at it every week, and that's what you say, I'll have a look at that every week. You, as soon as you're aware of it, you don't take it down, you become the publisher. So not only is Mr. Jones of 55 Acacia Avenue the publisher of this comment saying Mr. Snooks is a pedo, you are as well as the notice board. But you're only a publisher when you become aware of it, or when you should reasonably have become aware of it.
Which has been a long precedent in British progressive sort of common law.
It's a long precedent in the common law in the context of notice boards, and it was adopted quite early on with the development of what's called organic content on things like Facebook and Twitter. Organic content is content that is put on by the user without any positive scrutiny before it's added on. Whereas an advert, for example, typically, or Twitter's announcements or Facebook's announcements are published directly by them. So there's a proper procedure now, and this is in statutes and it's in EU law, it's in the e-commerce directive and so on, and we talk about it in more detail in the report if you're interested.
Which you can download online, by the way, and you should, because this is the direction of travel we want to go in. The direction of travel we are going in isn't this. It's the opposite of this. But anyway, we'll get into that.
So commercial break aside, we've got a perfectly good system for who is responsible, how they're responsible, when they become a publisher, and then so if Facebook is told Mr. Jones, now online because we're 2022, has put a tweet out saying I'm a pedo, I'm not a pedo, please take it down, Twitter. Twitter obviously can't respond immediately because it has a limited amount of resources.
Or ever when it comes to J.K. Rowling death threats.
Good point. And whereas if you put something about natural immunity or anything else on Twitter, then you might be removed. It might be removed very quickly indeed. But that's a fair and important point. But once it has had a sufficient period to be able to review with the kind of resources that it should devote to it, then it's had the opportunity to take it down. It either stands or falls. So it might say, well, there's nothing wrong with what was said, and we're happy for you to carry on saying that. It's political comment, or it's clearly true. You were convicted of this offence in 1999, and sorry, you are by law a pedo, so that's the end of it. It might take that view, or it might say, oh goodness, right, we're going to take this down, and then Facebook or Twitter won't be responsible for it. So that's the sort of compromise that we've reached over the last 15, 20 years. I mean, Facebook is nearly 20 years old, I suppose. Twitter's a bit younger.
But it's what's the word? Not ensconced. Ensconced. What's the thing? But it is in law already. There are provisions already to prevent what we call so-called. The problem for me, this is where I find it difficult. The words like safety and harm are subjective terms. They're not objective terms. So, as a barrister, can you explain how you would define harm or safety?
This is exactly it, and this goes back to the original point that I was making about the criminal law. And it's not just crime, of course, it's also, so we mentioned defamation, that's an obvious one. Of course,
Don't get me started on defamation, love. More coming soon.
Of course, you should be able to remove stuff that's defamatory, and there might be other things that are civil liability, but not criminal liability. But again, if you're the publisher of that, if you become the publisher because you've been given fair warning of it and you haven't removed it, you're as guilty of defamation as the person who put the comment up. And so that's fine. Now, it might be said that doesn't require you to remove these things. So yes, okay, there's criminal liability. So you as a website like Twitter or Facebook could be prosecuted for not doing it, but there's not a specific regulation. And we dealt with this in the report. There's no objection there. And I don't have an objection to this bill or another bill having a particular process for saying you're told about something that is a criminal offence, and it might be trolling. So trolling could be a criminal offence. It could be harassment. It could be harassment. I mean, harassment is a well-known.
And my Twitter feed is, I'd have 10,000 harassment cases a day.
Yeah. And you could report all of them to Twitter now, and probably they should be removed, because if they are of sufficient
I quite like
seriousness.
free speech, though.
Yeah. So
if someone wants to call me, I kind of draw the line at someone put up at one point, I'd like to unload both barrels of a shotgun into your face.
That's quite extreme.
I was like, I think I might report this one. But mainly what it does to me is it makes me just not read my replies. I think beyond a certain point, and you were saying before about MPs and stuff like this, the constant Twitter, due to its anonymity and all of this stuff and its inability to edit and all of these sorts of things, lead us to this place where people are expressing their own internal frustrations rather than their actual opinions. So, sorry, I interrupted you.
I was talking about harassment.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I suppose what I'd say to that is you are you, and that's fine. You might have a harder, thicker skin. No, I'm trying to say
I deserve the abuse.
But you might have a thicker skin than
I don't. I'm really sensitive. I don't read it.
Yeah, but that's a sensible idea, not to read the abuse. But again, harassment. The point we make here is Parliament's decided where the law should lie, and sometimes, things will happen in the future that it hasn't anticipated. It might want to think about it. It might want to think about how the law has changed. But there's certainty there. So when you have an offence like harassment, the Computer Misuse Act is another one. It's not perhaps as clear cut as it should be.
What's the Computer Misuse Act?
Well, Computer Misuse Act it is.
Is that a new one too?
Creates an offence. No, it's not particularly new. It's not new. I mean, it obviously goes back to
Alan Amstrad
it's 1990s or 80s, and there are other offences that have been. In fact, there are some offences that go back to the early years of the telephone, and in the 1930s, I think there was a particular offence was created because people were having harassment through breathing and deep breathing on the telephone and things like that. You probably remember that. So that was made. That was as early as I think the 20s or the 30s.
So that's the beginning of. That's the seed.
So that's a fairly long history.
Communication. So once you can communicate with someone not face to face, there becomes an element of what we call the need to protect someone's mental health. Is that what this is based around?
And I mean, it recognises, as the law always has recognised, that the old expression, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." But in reality, the law has always recognised that you can be caused harm by words. So there's such a thing as a technical assault, for example, where you're threatened with an assault, you immediately apprehend the assault, and you could have a heart attack if you're very vulnerable or something like that. But irrespective of that's an offence. So that's not a new concept. And you could take a very absolute scenario. There was a debate the other day, organised by Together, where a professor, took a very typically academic, very extreme view, frankly, and essentially was saying, well, you should be able to say anything. He didn't quite say you should be able to incite somebody to murder, but it wasn't far off that. I don't take that view. I think we've got Parliament.
Manners. It's called manners.
Well, it's manners, and it's also
societal norms, things that have developed over many, many generations that are passed down from a parent to a child, which is like, don't speak with your mouth open. Don't speak with your mouth open. Don't speak while you're eating. Don't eat with your mouth. These tiny little sort of frisons of society that have been passed down. Why are we now legislating towards them?
So the law doesn't regulate manners and shouldn't, and the law shouldn't be there to regulate morals. We're not in Saudi Arabia, thank goodness. But there is a parallel to what you're saying about parents handing down to children and developing a sort of societal norms. There's a parallel with the common law, and there's a parallel with Parliament, and there's a parallel with laws. And laws arise that. So you have a higher test for laws.
Sorry, what does a higher test mean?
Well, in that you're not going to say you are banned from eating with your mouth open in law, but you might say if you are threatening somebody, sending them really horrible letters in the post or messages on the internet, and there comes a point where that has to become a criminal offence. So we've decided as a society, as a community, and that decision is where it should lie. There should be that level of certainty.
The threshold.
The threshold is where Parliament and the courts have left it. It's certain, it's reasonably certain. It's not completely certain, because obviously what is harassment is always, there's always going to be
an element of discretion.
An element of discretion and an element of uncertainty about what words mean. And that's why you have court cases, because nothing is certain. There'll be some cases where you've got a clear threat to kill. It's obviously harassment. It might even be a more serious offence of threat to kill if it's actually intended. The person's intended to fear that death. But you may, at the other end of the spectrum, you might have a few messages and somebody says that's harassment to the extent it's a criminal offence, and there needs to be a trial. And it's
but the
not
law
certain.
has always seemed to me to be has erred on the side of precedent and caution, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And objective truth. So it's gone, this is objectively, if someone says, I'm going to come around and chop your head off, then I would take that as a serious threat.
Yeah.
But if someone goes, you deserve to die, that's a different threat, isn't it?
Exactly.
So then we get into this area of what the difference between harm and safety is. And I'm no legal genius, as you may have noticed, which is why you wrote the paper and not me. But what effect is this having on? Just rounding it back to the freedom of speech issue. What effect?
We should get back.
Is it because the best part of this is it is good to to wander through the area rather than.
So the reason it's important to do that is because in the report and currently we have these relatively clear boundaries. So we've got criminal offences, we've got civil torts.
What's a civil tort?
Civil torts are civil action. So defamation, for example, is a tort. Tort just
Why are you
means wrong.
pointing at me again? He's pointing at me again. Calm down, dear. Looking for a barrister.
So it means wrong in Norman French, and which was the origin of.
It means wrong in Norman French.
Yeah.
Tort.
Tort.
Oh, I love the French. It's great. Sorry,
a bit of Vikings there as well, with the norms. So that's what it means. And there's criminal liability on the one hand, civil liability on the other. And we've got those relatively clear thresholds. And there's always going to be this level of uncertainty in some cases, but relatively clear. The problem with what was the online harms bill.
Another subjective term.
Very subjective. And is now the online safety bill, which might come on to why that's a concerning term as well, because it raises all sorts of issues about
which issues. Let's go there.
Oh, okay, we'll go there straight away. Safetyism, which is a concept that was a word that was invented really by two authors called Lukyanov and Haint.
Jonathan Haidt.
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, I've read him. He's great.
The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah, brilliant.
Published not that long ago, for 5 years ago or so. And their focus was the college campuses in America, which are particularly...
Going really well. It's going
difficult.
It's going well over there.
Really well. So anyone who values debate, speech, the ability to speak about controversial issues...
Hit up the colleges in America and you'll
might be best not going to places like the University of Pennsylvania or anywhere in the
Yale,
Ivy League, really.
Yale now
Anywhere
as
in
well.
the Ivy League, and probably most places in the United States, because you will have screaming students. And
Do you think that's because of a lack of I was speaking to my defamation lawyer the other day, and I was just saying, I was speaking to him the other day, and he said to me, the thing is, our generation, like the plus 40 generation, anyone who's over 40, has probably had a relatively classical education, who's been taught to present an argument and reason it forward to a conclusion and then put it in front of somebody else. And he said to me that what he's noticing, even in younger lawyers, is that they're coming through with a very different take on things, which brings us back to this idea of safetyism and all of this, this subjective take on the world, which is they view these things through personal moral moral rights and wrongs rather than legal ones. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Do you encounter that?
I think so. I mean, I don't think it would be fair to say I encountered it in younger lawyers. I suppose people who go to the bar, my side of the profession, are by definition those people who like an argument, and therefore, even if they might be disproportionately on the sort of left/liberal side of the spectrum, which might be right, perhaps, they're still brought up in that debating, mooting, sort of arguing tradition. Okay. You know, so I when I was at university, I went to competitions, and you were just given a motion. 15 minutes. You're on one. You're told which side you're on, and you argue it, and you argue everything from a socialist perspective, from a right-wing perspective, from a pro-Islamic perspective, or from whatever it might be.
Doesn't matter what perspective it is.
And it's a really good training to get you to understand different people's points of view. And in fact, the inability to do that, and this sense that, again, Hoar, Hainton, Lukianoff writes about it, Douglas Murray, whose book I see up there, has written about it too, and others have. This kind of point that it's offensive to you as a human being, or perhaps somebody from a particular minority, for you to even mention an argument, and that's you take that as an offence, even as a harm.
But they're violent. It's violence.
It's violence against. Yes, this is exactly the kind of term. So that.
Why is that so dangerous? Is it? I'm trying to find the good part of all of this, which is has it come?
Difficult.
Has it? I know, and you're going to explain to me why. But has it come from the fact that I don't know how old you are. Can you tell me how old you are?
I suppose.
Are you over 40?
45.
Oh, well, good. You and I are a year apart in age. So we grew up more in the sticks and stones may break our bones category.
Yeah.
And this newer, younger generation are growing up bombarded with information, and, in their young minds are being corrupted. They're on Instagram and they're constantly filtering out their teeth and trying to make their cheeks nicer and all of that sort of stuff. Is the intention to protect young people from actual harms that you and I could never perceive or understand? Because
nominally,
but why? Okay,
I don't think it is. I mean, I think nominally, but I think I those people who are promoting this agenda are not stupid.
Who are those people?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, but there is certainly a movement which is against the classical understanding of the importance of freedom in general, but particularly freedom of expression, and it's not promoted by people who are stupid. So I give them credit for their intelligence, and I say they must understand that what they are doing is actually going against the need, the freedom of expression, which is a cardinal, it's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution for a reason. And John Stuart Mill, who I quote quite extensively in the introduction to that report, said quite rightly that it is the heart of all freedoms, because if you can't discuss and debate, how do you get not only getting to democracy, which comes a lot later down the line, how do you get to have a good legal system if you can't discuss things honestly, discuss what laws you should have, whether or not you are able to defend yourself? Even that, we take that for granted, but even that wasn't as absolute and took time to develop. I mean, criminals, those people accused of treason, for example, a few hundred years ago were not allowed to speak in their defence. They barely had a free trial because it took time to become a liberal society. We weren't a liberal society in the Elizabethan age. We had the building blocks to it. We had relatively free elections, limited franchise, less limited than it became actually as it happens, but relatively limited franchise. But we had a relatively free legal system and so on. But it wasn't perfect, and it took time to develop.
Nothing is perfect.
Nothing is perfect. It's all progression,
It's like
and it took
trust
time
science.
to build.
It's like, what fucking science? Sorry, it's like science is an ongoing conversation in the same way as law
And
is an
again,
ongoing
that goes
conversation.
back to this point about freedom of speech being the archetypal right, the origin without which other rights can't exist.
The scaffolding with which you build
absolutely, and you have to have that, because speech is how, and speech itself is how we develop civilization. And that's another point that Mill identified. It's how we build societies, even before we get to any kind of concept of law. So it's the archetypal, essential freedom. Everything else is built around it, and that sense that speech can harm. Now, obviously, it can harm when you're creating somebody physical distress, but the idea that an idea can do that, if an idea can do that, then that is somewhere where the law should not prevent it.
So
Quite the reverse.
that's quite interesting. So that's a subtle difference. So just random pinging people evilness and saying that's wrong, but the fact that you can even hold an idea in your head which can or cannot assist in the progression of society as it continues to evolve, like it's sort of like the Big Bang society, isn't it? It's still expanding the whole time, and our understanding of civilization, that those two things are actually quite separate. The fact that there's a specific harm, chop your head off, and the other one is this idea is non-debatable.
And it's not just job, it might be making you unsettled if you leave your house. I know where you
I'm
live.
unsettled when I wake up every morning. So is everybody else.
So is everyone. But there might, to a more extreme sense, but you get the point. That's on one side. And on the other side is you, by even discussing the, for example, in America, to use an example of, but to use an American example, because America's where this sort of safetyism culture started, even to suggest that you should not rip down all the statues in the campus because one of them might have owned slaves, as most white people did, or a lot of white people did in America in the 200 years ago in general. Even to discuss not tearing them down is offensive to me, and therefore it is a crime of some sort, or it puts me at jeopardy. And that's not saying. Not advocating support for what these people did, and this isn't to say anything one side or the other on that argument. It's just to say there is an argument, but that's the kind of argument that's made in the United States quite routinely.
So, devil's advocate to me. Explain to me why that's a good argument. Tell me why. So you're the person on the campus. You're the person who's representing the people on the campus who say every statue's got to go. Tell me why that's a good idea.
Being that person arguing for that point of view. Well, they would say we have suffered so much oppression, systematic oppression, that this is part of our identity, and therefore to even advocate for the retention of this, or to even argue
you're losing this case already.
I'm losing this case because it's such a bad argument.
Come on.
It's not. It is a terrible argument.
So why is it there? And why are we tolerating it? And why? And it brings me round again to this whole idea of this online safety bill.
Yeah.
It's like, why are we doing this to ourselves?
So I think going back to the online safety bill, because we've strayed a fair bit.
Yeah, but the whole point is I just want to sort of talk philosophically about it.
Yeah, it's all part of the background. So the objection to the online safety bill is that it is not sufficiently tight in its definitions to ensure.
Intentionally or unintentionally?
I think probably intentionally. Intentionally in that the government in its white paper originally, the last government, albeit still Conservative government, Theresa May government, 2018 was when the white paper was first put out, and it went through a couple of iterations, and then the bill was published in 2021. The bill was published just after we were writing the report. So I think we revised the report once the bill was published to take account of it. So they could have said criminal offences, civil wrongs, you have to take them down. If you're notified of them, you become a publisher after however many days it might be. If you don't have enough resources, then we expect you to have enough resources, because part of this is a resources issue, and part of the reason why this has a lot of traction in Parliament, discussing this before we started, is, I think, and I know this actually because I've spoken to MPs I would have expected to take a slightly different line on this, and it's quite obvious to me that they are themselves personally engaged in this because they are victims of harassment, trolling, and so on. I think probably every MP is to some extent, and every person,
Anybody who's
every
got more
public
than
person
10,000 Twitter followers.
Exactly.
Yes,
that's very true.
You've stuck your head above the parapet over liberty issues, and I'm sure you get a huge amount of abuse. But isn't that just part and parcel?
Yes,
of living nowadays.
Yes, it is.
Why legislate against it?
But again, going back to what we were saying before,
I'm not good at that.
The MPs, again, what they don't appreciate, because the job of an MP seems to me to think that every wrong needs to be legislated for. So if the police are, for example, not enforcing a particular law, well, let's have another law. Well, the answer is actually get the police to enforce the laws that we already have. Nearly always, when people say, "Oh goodness me, this should never happen, let's have a law about it," you will find there are perfectly good laws about it. They may or may not have been enforced. There may have been a problem with the police force, but nearly always that's where the problem is. So in this case, if they're trolled to a serious extent, it probably already is harassment. If Twitter isn't devoting enough resources, then fair enough, require Twitter to review something within a particular time and say to Twitter impliedly, you're going to have a certain amount of resources to do this, and you make loads and loads of money, put your resources into dealing with the complaints. That's perfectly sensible.
That makes sense to me.
And if the bill had said that, and in fact we sort of suggested an alternative type of bill, we say you're told about something, if you've got reasonable suspicion, it's a criminal offence, you take it down for an investigation. After a period of investigation, if you find that it is a criminal offence, you remove it, or if you don't remove it, you become responsible for it. And then if the courts eventually find it's a criminal offence, then you are hoist by your own petard if you're Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah.
That's sensible. And to some extent, some of that is in the online harms bill. But the problem is it extends it much beyond that to an adult of reasonable firmness caused harm, which
firmness.
Yeah.
That sounds
exactly. It's not particularly defined.
Like some of those magazines that we used to steal from newsagents when we were younger.
Yes, and it's not particularly well defined. And also, it doesn't take much imagination to think of. Yes, there of course there are freedom of expression exceptions. There's there's democracy exceptions, but. Think of art, think of Shakespeare, think of films. There are all sorts of films that could
white.
Cause, but also
can we just
some of it's pretty terrifying.
He's white, Shakespeare.
Yeah.
He was white, apparently.
So
can't go.
But high art or low art or any sort of art.
Crap art.
And crap art.
There's a gallery down the road which is full of crap art. It's just blokes in dresses, and they're selling for tens of thousands.
There's a museum in Boston for the museum.
No, it's not. It has a long history, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry.
But anyway, I mean, it's not difficult to think of what could cause you artistically an adult of reasonable firmness harm.
What is an adult of reasonable firmness?
It's a figment of the writer of this report's imagination.
Personal sensitivity. But that's not
exactly.
Someone's personal sensitivity is not how society works.
Exactly.
Society is like, if you just look at the whole idea about the nudging and coercion and stuff like that. It's like if you get enough people to do something that is for the benefit of mankind, or for the perceived benefit of mankind, then it's it's a noble lie, isn't it? In one way, but this is the coercion of something which is not physical, it's intellectual, it's emotional, it's sensitive. So why is somebody going after why are we allowing as a society the individual sensitivities of someone to become part of what might be a law?
Because we're in the culture of the nudge. The whole point about the nudge unit and the SPY B and the behavioural science over the last 2 years is to push people into doing things that the state perceives are for the greater good. That dangerous, very undemocratic phrase that's being used a lot without reservation by
They'll follow the science
governments.
but don't follow the law.
Absolutely. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand is the idea that ideas themselves are dangerous. And that's the particular problem. And we see that with Ofcom, and we see that with Twitter, and we see that with Facebook, when they ban people from discussing anything that might encourage people not to follow public health advice. And that's not to say, that's not even, you must not follow public health advice, you should not get vaccinated, for example. It's not even, although that would be clearly totally offensive to human rights.
They'll go COVID-19 warning.
Yeah.
The minute you mention the word.
But that would be totally contrary to any idea of freedom of expression. But it goes further than that. If you even put on, and this happens on Twitter quite routinely, an academic peer-reviewed report which says, for example, asymptomatic transmission is very much lower than they said, it's 0.7%, you will get a warning and be told you have to remove this or be suspended from Twitter. And that happens to people. It happened to me as it happens, because that's the specific example that got me. It was an academic.
Have you been a bad person?
I was told to take this down, and I did only because I didn't want to be banned from Twitter. So that's just an example of what Twitter does.
Would this make it worse, though?
I'm not saying
this is great.
In itself, the Online Harms Bill doesn't say that, but it is capable of that form, and that's the problem.
Which it will do. It's exactly like the Equality
If we're
Act.
going in its direction, where the state says you mustn't say things that might encourage people to not follow public health advice, only in an emergency, of course, or it's only an emergency.
Of course.
And it won't be the case always, and of course. It's just an exceptional period, unprecedented. It's not unprecedented, obviously, but that's what they will say. And if we're going in that sort of direction, and you have this nebulous concept of adult of reasonable firmness, it's very easy to see what could be banned, and it's in fact impossible to see what could be banned in one sense, in that we don't know how extreme the census will become in the future.
But the whole idea of it is that. If you create a piece of legislation in order to solve another piece of legislation, usually, don't they? So you create. I always found like about day 3 of starting up the Reclaim Party, I read the executive summary, admittedly, of the Equality Act, or whatever it was. I was going through it, and I had to have someone come in and explain it to me. And I was going, "Why is it called the Equality Act if it has protected characteristics within it?" I don't understand. It seems confusing, because the opportunity here is to go, well, I'm going to use my protected characteristic to create a sense of equality that's personal to me. Do you know what I mean? It's like you said it earlier on. You said racially aggravated assault, for example. Now, there is a history, certainly a much bigger one in America, but there is also a history in the UK of racially aggravated assault. There is. But why did we determine the fact that we would give someone some more time in jail? So if you go and stab someone, the terrible murder of Stephen Lawrence, for example, which gave birth to non-crime hate incidents and this sort of thing in its own way, why would one need to modify? You know, when they go social justice, they go, and I just go, no, justice, better, justice. So why should somebody who murders another individual, why should there be aggravating factors to that?
That's a whole other debate. That's a whole other debate.
I quite like the debates.
It's good. And I think the decision was taken that if there is a particularly prevalent type of racist violence that
homophobic violence,
or homophobic violence, because that's actually
transphobic violence now.
But that hasn't come into. So homophobic violence, funnily enough, has come into incitement to commit homophobic offences and racism. So it is defined, and you might say that hating somebody for a particular reason is not necessarily any worse.
But it's subjective.
So because it's subjective. But there's also the fact that judges have a huge discretion. So if you are convicted of a particular offence, you may not have that additional ability to sentence them for an extra period of time, but you might put them at the higher end of the spectrum if you consider that, for example, they've taken a particular hatred to this person for not for racial reasons, for other reasons.
But it's not massively different from what's going on here.
Conceptually, you can certainly see the argument that you shouldn't have this written into law and you should give the judge more discretion. And I'm very sympathetic. I practiced for most of the first few years of my practice in crime, and I have a lot of sympathy for giving judges more discretion. And I think judges have been, a lot of the time, with so-called right-wing governments saying we've got to be tough on crime, we've got to have minimum sentences, we've got to have high maximum sentences, we've got to really tell the judges what to do. I think that's a wrong approach. I think actually judges, on the whole, of course you see bad examples in the press, but on the whole, they get it right. And in fact, when people are asked in the street, what do you think this person should, they set out the offence and they say what happened. And they say, oh, I think this. And that's usually more, the sentences are tougher than that, usually. So I think there's a lot of sympathy for the idea that you should give judges discretion, and also that it's an appalling thing to commit a crime because of racism, and that will make it worse. But there are other reasons that might make it as bad, or if not worse, than that particular offence. And it all depends on the person. It all depends on the defendant. It all depends on the facts.
So fundamentally, what you're saying is, once someone is ending up in front of a judge, then we should let the judge, with their vast experience, and my encounters with judges over my life have been that they've been incredibly fair. I've never met one that has not been incredibly fair. Even in very difficult situations, I've found them to be very, very fair. So is the online safety bill going to tie their hands? Is it going to...
I don't think it's going to tie their hands, but the difficulty is you can't... I mean, you should not be legislating for judges to decide everything, because there are a limited number of judges and they should only be adjudicating in extreme circumstances, or relatively extreme circumstances. And here you've got this whole regulatory setup in under the Online Harms Bill, and the body that's actually regulating it is Ofcom. And Ofcom...
Bollocks, is
Ofcom, it? Yeah. Ofcom is the body.
Oh, I get the game.
So they are the regulatory body. They are in charge of all the regulatory standards. So at first instance, the people who are deciding whether or not Facebook, Twitter, etc., have sufficient mechanisms to apply their what's called duty of care to weed out offensive material is Ofcom. And so if a body is deciding originally, Twitter in the first instance, what might cause an adult of reasonable firmness severe distress, you can bet, because we know how Twitter think, that might include not following public health advice, and that might include publishing peer-reviewed evidence about things which undermines people's following public health advice, because an adult of reasonable firmness might die if they, as a result of this, didn't follow public advice. That's the extreme level that you can well see Twitter operating, because they already do. And if they apply that, and Ofcom applies a similar type of direction to broadcasters, then we know the way the wind is going. And yeah, okay, you could get a judicial intervention eventually on it. You might get some test cases, but we know who the body that is going to be regulating this is going to be, and they will set the tune for the standards that will be applied, and they'll do it to a very willing audience, because the problem is we have too much censorship from the Californian-owned, with the sort of typical very, very, probably very young, from the generation you talked about, very, very woke individuals who are censoring essentially Twitter. Yeah. They may do it through algorithms, but they decide the algorithms.
There's some parts of Twitter. There is definitely a movement forward about what we are going to accept as a society, for example. So that on its own level, if it was balanced, if Twitter or big tech came out and because I think they're much more powerful than any government anyway, and actually the government are essentially with this thing, they're just trying to go, look, it's not our problem. They're trying to abrogate responsibility for this. But there is no balance in the whole thing. So what I want to know is, what would you do?
Well, this is, again, the report that says this, but my view...
We're the clever people who thought it through carefully for your sake.
Yeah, well, my view on that
He's the
is
clever
that no, but we should do the opposite of not the opposite of what the government does. We do some of what the government do, which is have a particular regulatory structure about complaints and operating on complaints in a particular time. And if Twitter say, sorry, we don't have enough employees, you say, tough. If you haven't removed this within 20 days, or within perhaps a shorter period, if it's particularly bad, then you take the consequences. And if you need to have more employees, you pay more money.
To have a dedicated department.
They already do. I mean,
do you think Elon's going to bring it in? He's already brought it in.
Well, no, but they already do. But they're spending most of their time censoring people for talking about asymptomatic transmission, rather than actually dealing with real harassment of people like J.K. Rowling or you.
I think, J.K. Rowling gets it hard, doesn't she?
Appalling. Yeah.
But they've left that video.
Well, anyone who speaks on one side of the gender critical.
Well, anyone who speaks about anything. I was talking to George Galloway yesterday. Now, me and George, I imagine if you left
Russian state affiliated media.
Do you know what I mean? Sorry, but that is just insane.
I mean, he does.
Yeah, but also take the pejorative,
funny,
take the sensitive, because I can also be sensitive, right? Yeah. I can also be sensitive. So I've now had, I don't want to get into Russia and Ukraine, but I've now been fed, Russia is bad. I've just been fed it solidly for about a month now. Russia is bad, and that's not just Putin, it's just Russia generally is bad. And that's what I feel, the people of Russia are bad. Which I don't believe I don't believe there are bad people and good people in every country.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter where you're from. What's happened is, to put under George Galloway's thing, Russian state-affiliated media, which he explained very cleverly to me, it's illegal for him to work for the Russian state media. So why would they put it under? It's just so laughable.
I think it might have been a joke. Somebody in California probably having a joke. I don't know.
Do you think it was a joke?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you can't ban Twitter from saying that if they want to have their japes. But what I do think...
Why aren't they putting it under David Davis's? Why are they putting it under George Galloway's? George Galloway has the Workers' Party of Great Britain.
Yeah.
Right? Whatever your criticisms or loves of George Galloway
are. Is that the one that used to be funded by the Soviet Union?
I don't know. I'm not. How long have I been in politics?
I don't know.
When did I phone you up? It was March 2021. So I've not been in politics long enough to know the ins and outs of George Galloway's career. I've seen things that he's done.
I've got to be really careful. He's seriously litigious, so I will be careful what I say.
Well, he's also, what he said to me was, we agreed completely on freedom of speech. He said, it doesn't matter what my policies are if I don't have the right to have a conversation about them with you. So my policies mean nothing. So essentially, George Galloway and I are on exactly the same side in that argument. We haven't even got to the reasonable bit, the second iteration of what forming an idea is. Do you know what I mean? So... I think we're in real trouble when. Well,
we were on what have I suggested?
Yeah.
And then we talked about Russians.
Well, we always. My problem is that I always just go.
No, it's fine. No, what I was going to say is I think we should hold. Poland has done this. And I'm not saying everything the Polish government does is right. Clearly, that's not the case. But in this instance, I think it has a lot of merit in it, which is to say, I'm sorry, if you are as big a company as Twitter, and you have, more to the point, as big a share of the audience for that particular type of debate, which is short messages expressing political beliefs, linking other things. If you are in that position, you are like the kind of monopoly that we regulate when you have an unfair share of the audience or of the consumers for particular products. And similarly, that means that you get subject to state regulation, and that means that you cannot remove content that you dislike or that you find offensive unless it is a criminal offence or a civil wrong.
Mate,
that's what Poe's done.
It's just common sense, that.
Yeah.
Now look, finally, I know that you're a proud member of Plaid Cymru. And you're a serious activist for them. But I'm going to give you this badge.
Oh, that's very kind.
Which you will
I am politically unaffiliated.
Which you will never wear. But I'm politically
But it's very kind. It's like a,
no, but I give one to everybody.
Thank you, Lawrence.
I'm sorry if I wandered around on all issues, but it's just
it's
just
been
nice
a
to
really
talk.
really good chat.
It's just more fun to talk and go what's right and what's wrong than it is to sit there and go. You know, I read this beautiful report, and it's so beautiful. But I have brain the size of squirrel, so it took a lot. And I really do encourage you to have a read of this if you've got the time and you're interested. And Harry Miller reads this once a week, our chairman, and I think it's great. But I just want to say I should have probably asked Francis to do sort of longer, more, detailed barristery stuff, but I'm just interested in talking, and it was a great pleasure to speak to you.
That's brilliant.
Love you, brother.
Thanks, Lawrence.